It's Mo. It is February 4th, and I have read one book in February, so it's time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. This is a video I do every month where I take clips of the books that I've read throughout the month and tell you about them. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes, and I try to tell you what I thought of the book, what it's about, if I liked it, if I think you'll like it. And the first book I have to talk about in February, I finished yesterday, and that is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, written by Frederick Douglass. This is an autobiography written in 1845, the first of several autobiographies or memoirs that Frederick Douglass wrote about his life, initially as a slave in Maryland and then escaping slavery, and how he became a free man, how he became an abolitionist, and his very influential life on the early Americas. I didn't really know who Frederick Douglass was, and I still don't know all the ways in which he influenced people, except that he was an extremely well-educated, self-educated black slave that grew to obviously understand the evils of slavery and eventually free himself from slavery and became a strong political figure. I know this vaguely through like cultural osmosis, but this is not something I was ever taught or learned in school or anything like that, and it goes along with my theme of America specifically and purposefully keeping people in the dark about slavery and America's horrible history with that inhumane practice, and how slavery in early America has played a big part in creating the racial problems that we still see today and the racism that we see today. And as I've been reading more social justice works and histories, as I've been reading the history of influential Black Americans, I have heard more and more about Frederick Douglass. He's obviously cited often in many different people's writings, and so I wanted to read his story that he wrote for myself to learn more about his history. This first autobiography is from basically his birth and the earliest times he can remember to his running away as a slave and becoming a free man. And it seemed to me that this was written as his own first-hand account, how he came to be able to read and write, how he became an educated man, so that he could show people that he indeed was that, and also to explain slavery and the evils of slavery to people who might not realize that it was happening. And again, this is written in 1845, but I think it's totally relevant today because there were things in this book about slavery and the practice of slavery in the Americas that I didn't know or had only heard about, and to know that this information was readily available and could have been taught to us since 1845 is like extremely like disheartening and discouraging that like, yes, these narratives exist and this autobiography exists and you can get it, you can go out and seek it yourself, but it is kept from us in our education of the Americas in many respects. I thought that this was a really important work. It's extremely short, although it was written many years ago, and does have a aspect of the speech and the style of writing being difficult to read because it's dated for current readers. I think it's also extremely like simply and explicitly like stated so that there is no confusion about Frederick Douglass's past and his life experiences and the true nature of slavery. So I definitely think this should be required reading. It's, you know, again, extremely short. High schoolers could definitely read this. Young people could definitely read this. Young adults could definitely read this, and everyone probably should. It's very difficult to read, obviously. It has a lot of extremely hard subject matters, extremely hard language, racial slurs, and depictions of cruelty, brutality, rape, etc., etc. So in that respect, it was very difficult to read. It was also very difficult to read because, like I said, instead of empowering me to feel a hope that our society is better than it was, in many respects, I don't think it is, and in many respects, I think that we have just switched the ways in which we are cruel and terrible as a society. It wasn't a happy read, it wasn't a fun read, but obviously it was a crucial and essential read. And that was the first book that I read in February. It is February 8th, and I have finished one more book in February. I finished The Night Tiger by Yangsze Choo. I do have a physical copy of this, and it is coming off my Read What You Own challenge, but I did read this book on audio. And I have to say, after having read another of Yangsze Choo's books last year and now having read this both on audio, I think that's the only way I would really read more Yangsze Choo, because she narrates her own books and it's amazing. She does such a great job. She has such a lovely voice. She's such a great reader as well as being the author, so she also knows exactly what she intended to say. The Night Tiger is about Jaylin, a young woman who lives with her mother, brother, and stepfather in Malay, which is the previously used term for Malaysia. Jaylin has taken a disreputable job at a dance hall to pay off her mother's mahjong debts. And one of the reasons that Jaylin does this is because she's a independent, strong woman, and she knows that her mother is not going to be able to leave the house to do these things, so she really wants to pay them off. But the other reason is that her stepfather is extremely violent and beats her mother and treats her poorly. Jaylin has been spared his wrath, but her brother-in-law has dealt with it. Jaylin and her brother do get along, but her brother has recently moved out of the town where they lived to go to school to be a doctor. He's back for the summer. Jaylin is happy to see him, but she has to keep this secret of working at the dance hall to herself. Events happen that she comes into possession of a specimen, which is a human finger in a jar. She's trying to figure out ways to return it. She's trying to figure out ways to get rid of it. That kind of leads her to the progression of this story. And we're also following Ren, who has gone to work at a young doctor's house. This doctor works at the same hospital as Jaylin's brother. Ren is there because his old master, who has recently died, tasked him with going to this new house and finding his old master's finger, which the young doctor helped him amputate. One of the reasons it's important for Ren to reunite his dead master with this finger is because when your finger is cut off, sometimes you become a night tiger, a ghost tiger, a person who roams in tiger form. That's the basic premise of this story. Obviously, it's a fantasy novel, as was The Ghost Bride, which is the other book that I read by Yangsze Choo, and it's very complicated. It clearly has to do with Malaysian mythology and Malaysian history to tell this story of Jaylin and Ren. I really enjoyed this story. I really liked The Ghost Bride. I think I liked The Ghost Bride more. The Ghost Bride was a little bit longer, and I think it tied things up more nicely at the end. There was quite a few things in The Night Tiger that I didn't really feel like got resolved, and I don't know if that was a choice on the part of the author because she gave you enough hints to come to conclusions on your own, so to leave it open-ended and up to your imagination, or if it was a little bit of an oversight that she felt like some of the storylines were wrapped up, but as the reader, I didn't feel that way. I loved that there was a reference to The Ghost Bride in this, so I'm hoping that other books that Yangsze Choo has written that have yet to be translated into English, or that she will write in English, there might be stories to come within this universe of historic Malay. Both of these novels were historical fictions as well as fantasies, so there definitely is reference to Malaysian culture and heritage. If you're looking for light Asian fantasies, both of these stories I think are great. Light in that there's not like an extreme magic system that you have to figure out. There's a not long history that you have to know. I think especially in Night Tiger, Yangsze Choo does a good job of immersing us in the world without over explaining us with detail. I enjoyed that about these books. Like I said, I would love to read more of her work, especially if it happens to fall in this universe, and I would love to read it on audio read by the author. It is February 14th, and I finished 2 more books in February. I finished American Spy by Lauren Wilkerson. This was my TBR spin pick for February, and I had been meaning to read it for a while. I got it at a library sale at my local Asbury Park library, but I had heard about it before that and it sounded really interesting. It's not necessarily based on a true story, but it is inspired by true events of a young woman growing up in New York during the time of like the Cold War in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and her and her sister decide that they really want to be spies one day. You see this from multiple perspectives of our main character, Marie. In the first chapters, you see her in what is the present day in the 90s, and she is fleeing from an altercation at her house with her 2 young boys. And then you flash back to her being a young girl, her relationship with her mother, her sister, her father, how her sister really pushed to become a spy, and how later she joined up with the military in order to do that, and just Marie's thoughts and feelings on that and how it led Marie to joining the FBI eventually as well. During her time in the FBI, Marie is recruited by the CIA to spy on a diplomat from an African country and then later go to that African country to continue her work. So I thought this book was a really interesting premise and I was excited to read it. This is a debut and this book was just not up to the usual standards, I guess, that I'm used to now. So it definitely felt novice in its writing style. There were not a lot of passages or avenues for you to feel connected to any of the characters, and the writing was not like super compelling or interesting. There was obviously a lot of planning and research that went into this, but I think the execution of that planning and research really fell flat. There was a part where she goes to a restaurant in Chinatown and she uses snap-apart chopsticks, which seems like a very small thing, but I can almost guarantee that there were not snap-apart chopsticks in regular use in restaurants in the 1980s. So it felt to me like some of the research was like extremely extensive, and the real life people who ended up being characters in this book were researched, but then that research wasn't put to the best use. I also felt that the framing mechanism for this book, which is our main character Marie writing journals for her children to find later, didn't really work. The way that she supposedly wrote these journals and the way she spoke about her children in the journals were just things that you wouldn't write to a person. You wouldn't say it in the way that she was saying it, and you often forgot that you were even reading like journal entries because of the multiple time jumps of her explaining her childhood and then her working career and then the current day. So I think there were a lot of interesting ideas in this, but they weren't super well executed, and I think that I would be interested to read something else that Lauren Wilkinson did, but she definitely, I think, needs practice. And the next book that I read in February was Memorial by Bryan Washington. I'd heard so many things about this, especially when I first joined BookTube. This is a story about 2 men living in Houston who are in a relationship, and in the very start of this book, their relationship is on the rocks. They've had a couple of big fights. They're kind of contemplating whether they want to still be together. They still have feelings for each other, but a lot of the romance and lust and love has gone out of their relationship. And one of the young men, Mike's mother, is coming from Japan. He tells his partner Benson about this, and the same day Mike tells Benson that he is going to leave to Japan to see his father, who he's just found out is dying. So the day after his mother, who Benson has never met, arrives in Houston, Michael leaves to go to Osaka to find his father, who he hasn't seen in over 15 years, and leaves Benson alone with his mother back in Houston. So Mike is gone for an indeterminate amount of time. Benson is very confused and upset, and Michael's mother is very upset as well, and they have like a very tumultuous like early relationship over the months while Mike is gone. So the first part of this book is Benson and Michael's mother getting to know each other and coming to a sort of understanding about the predicament that they're in, and then the second part of this book is following Michael as he arrives in Osaka to look for his father and reconnect with his father if he can. It's not Michael, but they call him Mike in the book, so I should be calling him Mike. I liked that Mike was in the service industry. He's a little bit aimless and directionless in his career, and his father owns a bar, so he ends up getting to utilize his skills while he's staying with his father in Japan. I read this book on audio as part of my Read What You Own challenge. I'm trying to read books that I physically own on audio, but I found this physical copy in a free little library a few years ago. I did not think I was gonna like this book, and I did end up liking it. Like I said, I really enjoy like the service industry part. I liked the connection between Benson and Mike's mom. I liked the idea that you can stay with people or be with people without there being like a lot of drama, because all the relationships in this, there is drama involved, but they're also just all people. Although they do have differences and although they do fight, they try to treat each other with respect and care when they can. Benson and Mike's mom kind of come to a quiet arrangement of living where they're mutually respectful and helpful to each other, but they're not necessarily all up in each other's biz. And Mike and his dad rehash his father leaving them and the pain and trauma that went through, but they're never like mean to each other. They fight, but it just didn't feel like a TV drama or anything with any of these people. The reactions felt all very calm. Also, in a way, like everyone was taking care of themselves too. If Mike and Benson break up, where is Benson gonna go? It's Mike's apartment. If Mike's mom and Benson don't get along, who's going to stay in the apartment and who's going to leave? If Mike and his father don't come to some kind of like calm level, then, you know, Mike's not gonna have a place to stay in Japan and his father's not gonna have someone to take care of him. There's an undercurrent of like getting along and getting by in this that is both realistic and unrealistic and touching, and also a little bit too calm for at least what I'm used to in fiction, but also probably in real life as well. I liked the audiobook. Bryan Washington read the Benson part. I liked the kind of conclusion of this book in that it was left a little bit open-ended, but also some things were wrapped up. But overall, I don't know if I would ever really read this one again. I probably will be unhauling this copy at the end of the year. I'm glad to have read it, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of what Bryan Washington puts out. I know that he has a collection of short stories, but I don't know if he has any other novels, but I would definitely be interested in reading more by him. And those were two more books that I read in February. It is February 20th, and I've read two more books in February. I read Zikora, which is a short story that came with a subscription that I have, and I've actually had on my phone for a very, very long time. Zikora by Chimamanda Ngozi Adiche. I've never read any Ngozi Adiche before. I know they're sort of a controversial author, but I've had this short story on my phone for a really long time, and I wanted to move it off to make room for new free short stories, so I ended up reading this one. The narrator was Adipero Adoye, who also read Treasure, which I read as a short story by Okenyan Braithwaite, and I really, really liked that one. That was also from a free subscription. So Zikora is about Zikora, who is a young middle-aged woman. She's in her 30s. She's in DC. She's a lawyer, and she kind of has the perfect boyfriend. Her family is from Nigeria, and so is his, but his background is much more American influenced. They seemingly have a perfect relationship. He is kind and sweet, over-communicative, if anything, and she feels so lucky that she's advancing in her relationship and her job. When Zikora gets pregnant, her perfect boyfriend and her perfect life kind of fall apart. Her boyfriend does not want her to have the baby, but she feels like this is her last chance to have a baby. And the whole story is told from the perspective of while she's in labor. So the first part of the story, she's in labor and you're just finding out who she is, and then it's kind of told through flashbacks to her life, to a little bit about her friends and family, to her boyfriend, a little bit about what happened after her boyfriend left her, after he found out she was going to have this baby, her relationship with her mother. So there's a lot going on in this like very short story. It was an hour and 25 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes or something like that. And I feel like one of the characteristics of these free short stories is that they are always very detailed and nuanced, and there is a lot of conversation to be had. And this one being a more contemporary story, I think the conversations were a little bit more based in like reality, whereas some of the other stories that I've read are a little bit more fantastic or sci-fi. I enjoyed the writing style of this. I could see how it could be difficult though, because it did jump around in time quite a bit, and it did jump around in like perspective, even though it was always from Zikora's perspective. Sometimes it took a little while to figure out like where you were in the story. But I enjoyed the writing. What I did not enjoy was the story itself. Like, I don't like kids at all. I don't want to know about birth. I don't want to hear about it. So it was just a lot of that, like conversations with your boyfriend about having a baby, like talk about like going off birth control, talk about like pregnancy, and then talk about like childbirth. And it's just like, that's not for me. I don't enjoy it, so I don't really want to know about it. I'm not unhappy that I read this story, and like I said, I thought it was good. It just like gave me the ick. The next book that I read in February was Devil in a Blue Dress by Walter Mosley. This is a book that was written in the 90s but set in the 40s, and it follows Ezekiel Easy Rollins, who is a ex-soldier from Houston, now living in LA after the Second World War. So Easy left Houston to fight in the war and moved to LA, where he was able to get a job at an airplane construction hangar, and he was even able to buy his own house, which is his pride and joy. When Easy loses his airplane mechanic job, he really doesn't know what he's going to do for money. He's hanging out in one of his local haunts, Joppy's Bar, when a white man comes in and offers him $100 to help him look for a white woman, because this white woman is known to frequent black establishments. So Easy, like against his better judgment, takes the job, and of course all sorts of chaos and bad things start happening, and of course he gets into far more trouble than he was expecting and gets in way over his head. And this book has all sorts of ins and outs in a noirish fashion of Easy finding this white woman and figuring out what's going on and why these people are looking for her, and then deciding whether he's going to turn her over to them or not. Or is that even his choice? This book was made into a movie with Denzel Washington, and I also did watch the movie, which was fun. The movie was pretty good. It's very 90s, and it's 90s emulating 40s noir, which gets a little bit hokey and silly, but the book I think does a really good job of emulating 40s noir. And although there are a couple of modern things that sneak in, for the most part it feels very much of the period that it's trying to exemplify. This book reminded me a lot of Long-Legged Fly, which is written by James Salas, which is very similar. It's about a black man who kind of stumbles upon some trouble, but also stumbles upon becoming a PI. But that one was written by a white man, and this was written by a black man, and this is obviously like a more true representation of what a black man might have been going through or might have been thinking under these circumstances. I really enjoyed this. I hate this cover though, of course, even though we love Denzel. So I'm going to probably be unhauling this book at the end of the year, but looking for another copy. And I definitely plan on continuing with the series. I think there was a lot of interesting commentary, obviously, on race and the hierarchy and structure of like cities and workers, what work black people were able to get at this time, what work Hispanic people and other people of color were able to get. And I really liked that Easy had a strong moral compass, and that he definitely fought for what was right, but he knew that sometimes you have to fight dirty. There was a lot of really gross things in this book. There's child abuse, rape, sexual assault, murder, of course, like severe beating and assault and a whole bunch of yucky things, but I think it was done in a way that made them scary and disturbing without being overly graphic or gratuitous. I also thought there was a lot of players in this book that could come up later, which could be quite interesting. But I would say that one of the critiques that I have of this book is that there are a lot of people involved. There's a lot of people involved in the crimes. There's a lot of people involved in general, and sometimes it was a little bit hard to keep track of them. Like, for instance, there was 2 people who both had the last name Green, and it was very hard to distinguish which was which in certain passages, so I would find myself like having to skip back and see like what was that guy's name and what did he do and what was this person's names. If you've read Walter Mosley, I know he has quite a few books and standalones as well as the Easy Rollins series. Let me know if there's another Walter Mosley that I should pick up. Those were 2 more books that I read in February. It is February 26th, and I have finished 3 more books in February. A few days ago, I finished The Cutting Season by Attica Locke. This is a cozy mystery, I would say. It deals with some like heavy topics, but I would say that this is still a cozy mystery because it is not overly violent or graphic, and it does quite follow the cozy mystery overarching tropes and ideas, but then it does also deal with more heavy and realistic contemporary topics as well. Our main character is Karen, and she is originally from a small town in Louisiana where she lived on a plantation with her mother, who was the cook there for many years. Her family is tied to this plantation, which over the years was a working active plantation holding slaves. Those slaves were Karen's ancestors, and then later it was passed down through multiple reasons and forms to its current owners, the Clancys. And when Karen's mother was working on the plantation, she was just working as a personal cook, working for the Clancys, who lived in the big house and just treated it as their own property. They rented out the plantation fields behind their property to various local sugar farmers. As Karen's growing up, she's resentful of living on this property so far from town, so isolated from other people her age. But later she sees that her history and her ancestries is there, and when she struggles in her relationship to her baby daddy, and when Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, where she's been living after her mother's death, she returns to Belleville, the plantation that she grew up on, and becomes the manager of the new business that's there. The Clancy family still owns the plantation, but they don't live on it anymore. Now they have renovated and fixed it up to be a historical site where people can come and watch plays and see documents on the history of Belleville, but they can also have their wedding or their baby shower or any other private events. Although Karen trained as a lawyer, she has worked as a manager in the hotel industry, in bars, and now she is running this event space for her former childhood playmates, the Clancys. One morning when Karen is surveying the property, as she does every morning, she struggles to go into the slave quarters that have now been renovated to be historical sites so that people can go visit them museum style. She feels the ancestral sadness and pressure always when she visits these sites, but this day she feels extremely uneasy, and she cuts her observation of the grounds short. She cuts them just short of finding a dead body. Later, the 2 groundskeepers discover the body, and she is called to the site along with the police. It seems obvious that the body of the young woman is probably one of the plantation workers who once were all Black people from the surrounding areas and now are mostly migrant workers who come in for the cutting season. This book is following the mystery of our dead woman and figuring out who she is. Is she a cane worker? Is she someone else? How is she related to the plantation? How is she related to Belleville? Or is she at all, or was this just unfortunate circumstance? It's mainly the the story of Karen and Karen's relationship to Velvi, Karen's relationship to the Clancys, and the two Clancy sons who are now owners of the plantation. This book has a lot to do with Karen's relationship with her mother and how it ended on bad terms, unfortunately, before Karen's mother passed away. It's about Karen's relationship with her own daughter and how she doesn't want to see some of the mistakes that she made with her mother remade with her child. I really, really enjoyed the writing of this book. I think it was pretty straightforward. There were a couple of things, very cozy mystery things, like the repeating of certain phrases or certain characteristics of people that were repeated kind of ad nauseum, which can be irritating. But I think that those things were much more minor in this book than they are in most cozy mysteries. I liked the backdrop and the setting and the tumultuous relationship with Velvi that every single person who works there, who's lived there, who experiences it, has with it, because although it is a historic site and a tourist attraction, and although it is an event space, it also obviously is a place that held slaves, and slavery is ever present. So some of the people are happy that that history is being preserved, and some people are not happy about it. Karen has an interesting relationship with basically every member of staff. The current chef, Lorraine, worked under her mother, and now Karen's her boss, so there's a strained relationship there. She was good friends with the two Clancy brothers when she was younger, but because of social status and color, they were separated as they grew older. So there's a lot of interesting things here, a lot of conversation about historic sites and how they're used and what reverence should or should not be placed upon the sites. Every relationship in this book was nuanced and interesting and realistic. It felt very genuine in a lot of ways. But overall, I think the mystery was a little boring. It wasn't as exciting. And I think that some of the secondary mysteries, like Karen's ancestry and what that has to do with her relationship to Velvi, were interesting but didn't really go anywhere or further the story. And there were also a lot of plot holes in this. If at any time Karen had just talked to the right person, she could have solved a lot of problems and come up with a lot of answers to the questions that she had, or she could have just straightened out the whole mess that was going on more quickly. So there was a lot of plot devices used to continue the mystery, to make you nervous. And I think that this tried to be a very thrilling book. There were a lot of oh, spooky scenes, or is that someone walking along? What did I hear? Footsteps? But none of them were really that thrilling or interesting. So I did really like this book. I would definitely read more by Attica Locke. And I would actually read a sequel if there was a sequel to this, because there are a lot of things that are left kind of open-ended in this story. It wasn't one of the greatest mysteries or even the greatest cozy mysteries that I've read, but I did really enjoy it. The next book that I finished in February was Alice Walker's collection of short stories, You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down. So this is, like I said, a collection of short stories. It looks like it was collected in 1981, but there are stories from 1981 going back to 1971. It seems from the dedication and from some of the prefaces to some of the short stories that Alice Walker herself did collect these, and she collected stories that all had to do with women and their struggles in life, and specifically I think their struggles being modern women, whatever time period they were in and whatever modern women meant at that time. So a lot of the stories are very short. The majority of the stories are 13 pages or under, and then there's a 30-page story and a 20-page story, but they all have to do with strong women coming to grips with the world around them and either taking advantage of that to the best of their abilities or being trodden on by that. But ultimately, these are all women who are going to, in one way or another, take their fate in their own hands. The first story is about a woman living in the South starting in the 1950s, and she is a singer who is had minor success in her local area when a musician come to ask if they can record her song and buy the rights to the song. Later we see her and this young man, this young singer, forming a relationship, and how the singer became famous off of her song, which she's fine with. She feels she got paid adequately for it, and she doesn't sing that song anymore anyway, but he keeps coming back to her because he doesn't understand the meaning of the song. So we see him as this fresh-faced, young, shy boy, not yet famous, and then as he continues in fame, as he becomes so famous that he buys her a Cadillac, as he becomes so famous that he's isolated from both his fans and his family and feels a close connection to this woman whose song he still doesn't quite understand despite what it has created for him in his life. That one was really interesting. There's one about a middle-aged woman who has a family, a husband, and a daughter, but she goes on a writing retreat and she decides that she's going to take a lover and the repercussions of that. All of them are very interesting perspectives on women's prerogative and strength and the ability to take control of their lives in one way or another. So I really like this collection. I'm definitely interested. I have another Alice Walker short story collection. It did take me a long time to read through, I think because a lot of the stories were very similar, so I didn't want to read them too closely together so that I could remember the individual stories. And even doing that, I still blended some of the stories together, and I really have to like look at the titles and think about what they are, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not something that I would prefer. I would prefer that when I read a short story collection, I know every story, I remember it. There's some that I love, there's some that I don't love, of course, like in any collection, but that I can distinguish all of them. And I felt that this one got a little muddied. If you're looking to read more Alice Walker, I think this is a really good one. The next book that I read in February was A Small Place by Jamaica Kinkaid. This is a nonfiction book about the island nation of Antigua, where Jamaica Kinkaid was born and lived some of her life. She also moved to America and lived in America as well. Jamaica Kinkaid is a little bit of a forgotten Black woman author in the vein of Alice Walker and Gloria Naylor and Toni Morrison, but she, I think, fell out of the public eye for a long time, and her books more recently came back into the public eye. I had a feeling that I was going to love Jamaica Kinkaid's writing, and I loved her writing in this. This was one of the most interestingly done and compelling nonfictions that I've read in a while. It definitely doesn't hurt that it's like 82 pages, and it really gets to the point. It doesn't have much time to set up the events of what you're going to be learning about. You just have to jump in and it throws you in. And it does it in such a fascinating way because the whole first part of this book, which is divided into chapters, but I would say about the first half of the book, is Jamaica Kinkaid talking to you as a tourist. So you are a tourist, she's talking to you in the second person. The whole book is written, the entire book is written in the second person. And she's saying like, this is what tourists do, this is what you think when you come to a country. You as the tourist want non-rainy days, and don't worry, Antigua is a beautiful place and it rains very rarely, and you as a tourist will be happy about that, but you don't understand that us Antiguans have to live with that our whole lives, and we deal with drought where every drop of water is precious. So it's told in this really interesting way, and the first part of the story is basically talking to you as a tourist and telling you how tourists kind of suck, one, and why it's necessary for Antigua to rely on tourist dollars, tourist money, tourist participation to keep their country running, but also the history of Antigua, how it was created and colonized by the British, and then how it was later abandoned by the British and the Antiguans took it over. And then the second half is all about how the Antiguans have also not done justice to their beautiful country, and they have continued to elect a corrupt and damaging government. This book was written in 1980. 8. It talks a lot about the history of the 30s to the 80s. The very last part is kind of the culmination of both these sections, and how, although Jamaica Kinkaid loves Antigua and loves her home country, there's so much problems with it. Some of it being a slave nation for Europe and England, and then being a colony of England and how that damaged them, but then how once they were freed from that colonization, they continued to harm themselves by choosing the wrong government and by not putting the emphasis on the proper things that would uphold the nation and better its communities. I loved the writing. I loved the history of it. It is obviously dated, being over 35 years old. One of the things that's quite striking about this book is Kinkaid's conflicting ideas and feelings about her home nation and about how that nation has propelled itself or been propelled by others throughout history, how much she obviously loves it and its culture in many ways, but also is so obviously and palpably angry at it as well throughout this book. Anyone who's interested in island nations in the Caribbean, anyone who's interested in Black women authors writing from the 40s to the 90s or anywhere in there, anyone who's interested in the history of Antigua, this is just a great book to read and a wonderful, short, amazing nonfiction. So those were 3 more books that I read in February, and if I read anything else, I will let you know. It is March 1st, and I read 3 more books in February. Since I'm in between Read What You Own challenges, I am trying to listen to audiobooks that I don't own physically, so I don't have to follow the rules of my Read What You Own challenge. And another book that I finished was A Righteous Man by Tochi Onyabuchi. This is one of those free short stories that you get if you already have a subscription, which I highly recommend taking advantage of if you do have that subscription. I read one other Tochi Onyabuchi book last year and I really enjoyed it. A Righteous Man is a very short story. The audio was only like 50 minutes, and it follows a white missionary from England who has come to Africa to convert the natives. This story takes place in the mid-1800s, and it is an epistolary story. So the entire story is this man writing back to his wife, telling of his experiences, his hardships, and his achievements in getting the locals to convert. He feels very passionately about spreading the word of God and converting the African villagers to Christianity, and he is a man of great faith. And he believes that it's right to convert the Africans. He lives with them in their village, and he really appreciates their kindness and hospitality that he is given by the villagers. But there are definitely things in their culture that he doesn't understand. There are the hyena men, which are men that roam the desert and countryside with their chained hyenas. At first he sees them as a threat, but when he's faced with the realization of slave traders and these traders kidnapping people from the village and the horrible reality of the slave trade and how these slaves are kidnapped and tortured, he begins to lose his faith. So this is a very, like I said, very short story, and it is just about his experiences, his great love for England, and his learning about the culture of this African village that he's in. And then there is definitely like a denouement to this story that is interesting, and kind of how he perhaps regains his faith through the humanization of the horrors of slavery. I definitely really like this one. It's extremely different from Riot Baby, definitely different tone, different writing voice, and it was interesting to see Onyabuchi do something so different. And I know that Goliath, which is like a sci-fi book and a longer novel, which came out in 2022, is supposedly very different from Riot Baby as well, so it definitely made me want to read more Onyabuchi, which is another reason why these short story collections are so great, because you can test out authors that you've never read, or you can get another feel for an author that you have read from before, which is awesome. The next book that I read in February was Toning the Sweep by Angela Johnson. This is a short YA novella, and it's in this super cute little Scholastic edition. I read Seed Folk in this edition last year. I loved Toning the Sweep. I thought it was so great. Toning the Sweep follows Emmy, who is 14, and she is going to help her mother and grandmother pack up her grandmother's house in California because her grandmother has fallen ill and needs to move in with the family in Ohio. Where Emmy's grandma lives in California is a magical place to both her grandmother and her, and this story follows the 3 generations of women as they pack up the grandmother's house and get her ready to move. She's saying goodbye to all her friends. She's reminiscing about the past, the good things and the bad things, and she's thinking about the extreme circumstances which inspired her to move her and her young daughter to California. It's only about 103 pages. I loved the characterization of all 3 women. They were all very distinct and interesting, but there were a lot of ties and parallels that connected them through their family, through time, through history, through their actions. This book mostly deals with grief, grieving for someone who's sick, grieving for someone who you know is going to pass away at some point, grieving for someone who is still around, but you feel the loss coming. This book is about grieving for places that you wished you could have stayed, or that you miss, or experiences that you had that you wish you could have lived longer in. This is definitely also about that familial relationship and mother-daughter relationship, and how many times mother-daughter relationships can be extremely strained, and all the potential different reasons for that. It's about found family and finding your place in the world and doing things that bring you joy, and what happens when you have to leave those things behind and change your entire lifestyle. Powerful, impactful. I definitely cried in this one, and it felt very nostalgic and comfortable to me. The way that Emmy's grandma's home and life was described felt very nostalgic. It felt very hippie and very much like a community, and those things are nostalgic to me in my own childhood. I would love to hear what other people's thoughts on this are and see what they got out of this story. The last book that I read in February was Will Williams by Namwali Serpal. This was another of those very short stories, only about 45 minutes long on audio, and it is based on or inspired by a short classic, but I'm not sure which one, and I'm not sure who the classic was by, but basically Will Williams follows Will Williams from childhood through adulthood and through the causes and events that have led him to be incarcerated at a very young age, and then to continue to be incarcerated for his entire life. So the majority of this book does take place while Williams is in prison. Williams feels that he was wrongly incarcerated, and he follows this back to an early age when he was in school and a young boy joins his class. This boy happens to look like him. He wants to follow him around. He wants to emulate him. He happens to have the same name as him, a very close birthday to him. Will Williams sees this person as his nemesis and his tormentor. So this book follows Will and his doppelganger through time, how his doppelganger continually sabotages him, sabotages his life, and leads him on the path to prison. It definitely leaves things open and unexplained, which was really interesting. I'm sure that this somehow follows the classic that it's based on. I would be interested in reading that classic. Like I said, I don't even know what it was. But I think what was interesting about this was like the conversations around your own actions and whether you're responsible for your actions, if they have to do with other people or not. Like if you were spurred to do something by someone antagonizing you, don't your actions and your reactions to that person still belong to you, and aren't you still responsible about them? And I think another side of that conversation is maybe you are sabotaging yourself, and perhaps your actions cannot be explained by other people. I'm sure I missed something, but I did feel like there was also supposed to be a commentary or conversation had revolving around Black men's incarceration, wrongful incarceration, and their being blamed for crimes that they did not commit. I definitely think that there was something to be said, and the book was saying something about that, but to me it almost felt like it was saying the wrong thing, and that's why I think I probably missed something, because I can't imagine that this Black woman was advocating that Black men self-sabotage to the point of being unaware of what they do. I mean, was she? Maybe. Maybe that is the commentary she was trying to make. I would be really interested if you have read this story, what your take on it was, and what your thoughts about Will Williams' responsibility for his own eventual imprisonment was. So those were the 12 books that I read in February. It was a really good reading month. It felt like it was going to be a slow reading month, but I ended up reading quite a lot. A lot of those things were quite short. I read some great nonfiction. This was the first slave narrative I ever read, and I definitely plan on reading more. It was really fascinating and a great look into part of our history that I have never explored and never been encouraged to explore. Bookish just did a really great video on slave narratives, so I will leave that linked in the description below, and I highly suggest you check it out. And then I loved A Small Place. So happy to have read A Jamaican Kinkaid, learn more about Antigua, and read a nonfiction that I'd never heard of. I read a collection of short stories, and then I also read a bunch of short stories. I read a novella. I read a couple of mysteries / mystery thrillers / noir. I read a spy espionage, and I read a fantasy, which is weird. American Spy was my TBR spin book. Don't forget that I will do a full update on my readathons in my readathon recap video, which will be coming out after this one. I read a lot of variety, which again was something that in the beginning of the month I didn't expect to do. Let me know how your reading month in February went. Let me know if you've ever read any of the books that I read here and what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!